Elizabeth Bathory, Čachtice Castle, December 30, 1610. They found the girl hanging upside down, her blood still warm, pooling into a silver basin like wine meant for a queen. Her eyes were open, but she was no longer there. The stone beneath her was slick with months of death. Not one, not two, dozens. Skin had fused into iron hooks, hair matted with black rot, lips curled mid-scream. The walls drank every sound except for the whisper that kept returning. She said, "I would live forever." A stench clung to everything, like boiled meat and old perfume. The fire had gone out long ago, but the room was still warm and breathing. They kicked open door after door, everyone worse than the last. Girls, some just 12, splayed open like ritual offerings, bowls of blood, carefully labeled, sketches pinned to the walls, faces, veins, notations on age, purity, texture, a room filled with glass jars, each holding something, eyes, teeth, pieces of something once human. She called it research. And Elizabeth, she stood at the center in her black velvet gown, hands crimson to the wrist, her face calm as snow. "You're late," she said. "This batch is already cooling." No fear, no madness, just calculation. No one spoke. Even Georgi Thurzo, the king's man, sent to bring her to justice, couldn't look her in the eye. Not when she smiled, not when she offered him a glass of something dark and steaming. Because here's the thing no one wrote down. The experiments weren't finished. And the walls, they still remember her touch. Long before the screams echoed through her castle, Elizabeth Bathory entered this world without a sound. The midwife said the baby didn't cry. She simply stared, wide eyes, no flinch, no breath that anyone could hear. They called it a miracle birth, but the nurse who first touched her whispered that the girl's skin was cold, as if she'd spent too long on the other side. She was born into a fortress of blood and whispers. The Bathory family ruled eastern Hungary with iron and incest. They married their own to protect what was theirs land, titles, secrets. But the price of purity was rot, minds unraveled, faces twisted. The family tree bore fruit with too many eyes and too little mercy. Her uncle Istvan was a war genius who flayed prisoners for information and sometimes for pleasure. He kept a locked chest beneath his bed filled with tongues. He claimed it was for science. No one questioned him. Her sister Clara walked barefoot through snow, whispering to shadows. Her voice sometimes changed in the middle of a sentence, as if someone else had stepped in. One maid found her in the bath, speaking Latin to her own reflection while gouging her thigh with a spoon. Her brother Miklos was worse, quick to rage, slow to sleep. At 9, he beat a dog to death for staring. At 13, he stabbed a priest in the thigh for blessing his food. He said God had no place at the table. This was the cradle of Elizabeth Bathory. She grew up in silence, curtains drawn, walls too thick for comfort. Servants moved like ghosts, their steps barely brushing the ground. No games, no songs, only rules and blood. At 7, she watched her father deal with a peasant uprising. The rebels were sewn alive into the bellies of dead horses and left to rot outside the manor gates. Elizabeth didn't scream. She didn't blink. She asked how long it would take them to die. Her uncle smiled and answered, "Not long, but long enough." She remembered that. She remembered everything. Yet by 9, she was fluent in Latin, German, Hungarian, and Greek. She could quote civil code, canon law, and military doctrine. Her tutors praised her brilliance until she began correcting their sermons. She found contradictions in scripture and demanded explanations. None satisfied her. When she bled for the first time, her governess lit a candle to mark the occasion. Elizabeth blew it out. "I didn't ask for this," she whispered. Something inside her shifted. She began to collect things: a blackbird with a broken wing, teeth from a dead dog, threads from the nightdress of a maid who vanished. Nothing extravagant, just pieces, quiet pieces, forgotten things. At 15, the marriage was arranged. Ferenc Nadasti, a soldier, a killer, known as the Black Knight of Hungary. He was not handsome, but he was feared. He brought her a whip on their wedding night and said, to keep the help in line. She didn't laugh. She traced the leather with her fingers and said, It'll do. The wedding was a spectacle of fire and gold, trumpets, doves, feasts that stretched for days. But what she remembered most was the silence between the noise, the moments when eyes turned away, and no one dared to speak her name. They moved to Countess Castle soon after. It was high on a mountain, carved from stone and sky. No neighbors, no church, just the wind and the wolves and the iron gates that never opened without a reason. Ferenc was rarely home. War consumed him. He returned only to leave again, and when he did return, he brought gifts, curved sabers, Ottoman talismans, torture tools. She kept them all, hung them in her chambers like art. The servants feared her, not because she was cruel not yet, but because she saw too much. She never raised her voice, never struck them, but when they entered a room, they felt their pulse quicken, as if the air itself tightened around her. She explored the castle alone. She found rooms that weren't on any map, corridors behind walls, doors without locks or with locks that opened when they shouldn't. One night, she found a passage beneath the chapel. The stones were wet, the walls were narrow, and at the very end, a chamber with rusted hooks in the ceiling and drains in the floor. She didn't scream. She lit a candle. There were scratches on the stone, and stains that didn't wash away. She stood in that room for hours, not because she was afraid, because she wasn't. Elizabeth began sleeping less. She kept her eyes open in the dark, watching the moon shift through the slit windows. Sometimes she whispered to it, sometimes. She imagined it whispered back. The servants whispered, too, that she no longer cast a reflection, that she walked without sound, that when she smiled, the fire in the hearth dimmed. By 17, she ran the estate herself. Letters arrived in her name, decisions passed without counsel. She sent men to collect taxes and women to fill the kitchens, and if someone disappeared, well, they must have fled, or fallen ill, or never existed at all. She was efficient, brilliant, respected, but in the north wing, where the walls grew colder and time forgot to move, she began to listen, to the wind between stones, to the faint thump of her own blood in her ears, and sometimes to something else, a sound that wasn't hers, something waiting, but the blood hadn't spoken to her yet, not yet. The door groaned shut behind her, thick oak, banded in iron. It didn't creak like a door. It groaned like something that didn't want to be touched. Countess Castle was not made for comfort. It was made for war, for winter, for keeping things in. Elizabeth stood in her wedding gown, now dusted with ash from the journey, as the servants bowed and vanished into the walls. No words, no fire. Just the sharp scent of mildew and stone, long soaked with silence. Her husband was already gone. Ferenc Nadasdi had left days earlier, summoned to a campaign on the southern frontier. No farewell kiss, no candle at the window, just his boots, still wet with blood, left at the foot of their bed. Elizabeth unpacked alone. The first night, she wandered the halls without a lamp, dragging her fingers along the cold mortar, memorizing the rhythm of emptiness. The castle moaned in its sleep-distant shutters clicking, wind sobbing through keyholes. Somewhere deep below, she heard water dripping, slow, steady, like a pulse. She followed it, down spiral stairs, beneath archways crusted with moss, until she reached the old wine cellars. But the barrels were gone, in their place chains, rusted rings in the wall, a drain carved into the stone floor. She stared at it for a long time, then whispered, "You've been waiting for me." No one heard her, but something answered. Over the next few weeks, the castle swallowed her. Mornings came slow. Gray light trickled through the arrow slits. She no longer dressed in silks, but in layered wool and sable. Servants scurried in pairs, never looking up. She spoke little, ate less. Every plate tasted the same meat gone cold, bread like chalk. But she watched. She watched the maids carry linens from rooms that had no guests. She watched a girl limp down the hall with a bruise blooming beneath her eye. She watched a boy toss a bucket of water into the courtyard and glance up just once toward her window, his hands shaking. Ferenc returned with trophies. A curved scimitar, chipped at the edge, a horsehair sash soaked in dried blood, a whip, its leather black and gleaming. He handed her the whip like a gift. "They call me the Black Knight," he said, But your name will be spoken softer, slower. She ran her fingers along the braided leather. It was warm. At night, he taught her how to use it. On sacks of grain first, then pigs, then people. He said it was for discipline, for training, for extracting truth. But when Elizabeth struck, she didn't care about truth. She watched the face, how it twisted. She listened for the breath, how it caught between cries. She tested how deep the lash could go before the scream turned to silence. She was good at it. Ferenc called it a skill. You have precision, he told her. The soldiers swing wild. You carve. But when he was gone again, she practiced alone. The castle gave her its secrets, a staircase hidden behind a tapestry, a room behind a bookshelf, a trap door beneath the old chapel's altar, each space older than memory, lined with dust and bone. Someone had used them before her. Now, they were hers. She brought candles into the dark and listened. To the walls. To the echoes. To the stillness between her own heartbeats. One evening, a servant girl spilled a tray of wine at her feet, red soaked into the furs. The girl dropped to her knees, weeping, trembling as she tried to clean it with her dress. Elizabeth didn't move. She stared at the stain. Not the girl, not her fear, just the wine, slowly drying into the weave. Then, without a word, she stepped over it and walked away. But that night, she returned to the same hallway, same stain, still faintly red. She pressed her hand into it, lifted her fingers to her face, and smiled. Days blurred into one another. Snow buried the castle from the outside world. Elizabeth stayed mostly in the north wing, pacing like a caged falcon. The maids whispered she no longer slept, that she spoke in Latin to no one, that she had stopped casting a reflection. And still, Ferenc returned only in pieces 1 month, 2 always smelling of ash and violence. He was changing. The war was peeling something off of him. One night, he stood at the window, his back to her, and said, "I dream of drowning." Over and over. She touched his shoulder. He didn't turn. "I think I already have." He died not long after. A slow sickness. His muscles failed him. His voice slurred. Elizabeth never wept. She sat by his bedside, fed him broth, wiped the blood from his lips with cloth soaked in rosewater. In his final hours, he reached for her. "Don't stop," he whispered. "What we started, don't stop." She didn't ask what he meant. She already knew. The castle was hers now. Every stair, every corridor, every shadow. And for the first time, Elizabeth was truly alone. But something inside her was finally awake. The girl's name is gone now. No records, no bones, not even a birth parish to whisper her back into existence. But she was there, in the corridor outside Elizabeth's chamber, trembling, holding a silver basin too wide for her hands. She spilled it. The water hit the stone, and the girl froze, eyes wide, fingers fluttering like a bird about to die. Elizabeth looked down, not at the mess, at the girl, at the way her skin flushed red with panic, the pulse in her neck, the sound of her breath catching, that sound again, like a hinge just before it breaks. She slapped her hard, palm flat. The girl's head snapped sideways. A streak of blood bloomed across her cheek. It arced upward hot, bright, sudden, and landed on Elizabeth's mouth. Everything stopped. It wasn't the pain, it wasn't the apology, it was the taste. The copper, the heat, the way it lingered on her tongue, thick and raw and strangely sweet. She wiped it with her sleeve, then looked in the mirror. The blood clung to her skin like it belonged there, and her reflection, no. Her face looked different, softer, brighter, as if something had been fed, as if part of her had always known this was the missing ingredient. That night, she didn't sleep. She called for her handmaidens to bring herbs, oils, wine. One girl asked if the lady was ill. Elizabeth smiled. "No, I've simply remembered something." The experiments began small. A needle beneath the fingernail, a pinprick behind the ear, a scratch on the inner thigh, nothing fatal, just blood, just enough. She noted the warmth, the texture, how quickly it clotted, how fast the skin paled afterward. Then came the baths. She told the girls it was a beauty ritual from the East, that they were helping her maintain her youth. Some laughed, some obeyed, some disappeared. In the East Wing, she converted a room, stone floor, drain in the center, copper bowls, white linens. She installed a wooden frame, tall enough for a girl to be hung upside down, arms bound, chest exposed. She called it the angel. Each girl had to earn her way into the ritual. Some were selected for their skin, others for their silence, one for the shape of her veins. It didn't always go smoothly. Some screamed too soon, others fainted too quickly. She began to experiment with timing, how long before the blood cooled, whether lavender slowed clotting, whether fear made it thinner. She wrote everything down. In a book wrapped in goat leather, bound with a velvet ribbon, lined in her own hand. She tried cow's blood once, poured warm from the slaughterhouse. It made her gag. Too thick, too dull, no electricity, no voice inside it. Only human blood sang. She told herself it wasn't cruelty, it was discovery. She wasn't a killer, she was a scholar, an alchemist, a woman pursuing the essence of permanence. And still, she felt something watching her. Even as she worked alone, with no one near, she'd feel breath on her neck, a flicker in the mirror, a warmth at the back of her skull, as if someone were touching her with invisible hands. She didn't flinch. She welcomed it. She wasn't doing this for vanity. She was doing it for time, time that had never belonged to women, time that turned queens to corpses and beauty to ash. But blood it remembered. Blood was memory itself. One night, after a session, she sat nude on the marble floor, the basin beside her still steaming. A girl lay nearby, unconscious, still alive, barely. Elizabeth stared at the crimson pooled around her own legs. It shimmered like lacquer, smelled like rust and roses. She dipped her fingers into it, touched her lips, then her eyelids, then whispered, "This is what it means to stay." She began selecting her subjects more carefully. Not the sickly, not the old. Youth mattered, purity, a certain softness in the voice, skin untouched by labor. She recruited from villages under her family's protection, peasants too poor to protest, too desperate to ask questions. Some girls came willingly, drawn by the promise of warmth and bread and silk-lined beds. They were treated kindly, at first, until the locks clicked, until the sheets stained, until they realized the house had no exits once the door shut behind them. Elizabeth watched them during dinner. She'd walk the dining hall like a nun inspecting her flock, run her fingers along a girl's cheek, ask how she slept, smell her hair. Sometimes she'd say nothing at all, just stare until the girl looked down. The servants knew. They didn't speak of it, but they carried out the bodies. They cleaned the basins. They burned the linens. And when Elizabeth asked, "Was the blood clear today?" they nodded. Dorca came to her first, a woman of hard hands and harder eyes. She had once been a healer. Now, she was something else. She didn't flinch when shown the tools. She only asked if they were sharp enough. Then came Ilona, silent, long-haired, her movements too smooth, her eyes never blinking quite enough. No one knew where she came from, but Elizabeth said she had the right energy. Janos joined last, a servant boy, no older than 16, who saw everything and said nothing. She trusted him because he never looked away. Together, they formed a ritual, a machine, a study in blood and beauty. Elizabeth led them with calm precision. But even she knew she was no longer collecting answers. She was feeding something, and it was getting hungry. At first, it was only whispers. In the markets of Trensen, at the wells of Somorja, in the corners of stone chapels, where candles flickered low, a lady is hiring, they said, a noble woman, well-fed, fair-spoken. They said the girls who went to her came back clean and dressed like baronesses. No one noticed they never came back. Elizabeth called it charity. Her letters were written in her own hand, elegant, precise, generous. She promised education, decorum, grace, for girls of potential. The scrolls read, for daughters of virtue. They were sealed in red wax and carried by riders draped in the Bathory crest. They rode into famine, into plague, into households where soup was thin and shoes were made of straw. Your daughter will learn to write. They said, she will read psalms beside a countess. She will never hunger again. What mother would say no? They came in carts, dressed in their best rags, hair brushed flat, cheeks scrubbed raw, holding hands, eyes wide. Some clutched crosses, others clutched dolls. They were greeted with warmth. The gates of Countess opened, fires burned, bread baked. Elizabeth herself descended the steps to welcome them, cloaked in black wool and pearls. She kissed their cheeks, called them beautiful. Rest first, she said, then we begin. And they did. For the first few days, they were treated well, given soft beds, boiled eggs, warm milk. Their hair was combed, their hands were washed. They were shown how to curtsy, how to speak without showing teeth, how to sew straight lines. At night, Elizabeth walked among them, not like a queen, but like a teacher. She would kneel beside a girl struggling with stitches and guide her fingers. She would listen to their stories, laugh at their small hopes. You'll make a fine lady, she'd say, if you remain obedient. But then they started disappearing. Not in groups, one at a time, always at night. She was sent to the upper rooms. The maid said, "She is being groomed as a personal attendant," the cook explained. She ran away, said the guard, though the gates never opened. The beds were filled with new girls before anyone could ask twice. Some began to whisper. They heard chains in the floorboards. They smelled smoke from beneath the chapel. One girl, no older than 14, said she saw a servant carrying a basin filled with something dark, dripping. No one believed her. Another whispered, because she spoke the truth too loudly. She vanished the next day. The walls grew tighter. The smiles of the servants grew thinner. Elizabeth no longer walked among them. Instead, she watched. From the staircase, from the shadows. Her eyes moved like knives, carving flesh without touching it. She became obsessed with skin. She'd summon a girl, study her hands, her cheeks, the veins in her neck. She's too dry, she once murmured, fetch someone younger. She was searching for something, a shade, a purity, an alchemy of softness and fear. Sometimes, she would call for 3 girls at once, make them undress, inspect them beneath candlelight, touch their arms, their backs, their throats. Not this one, she'd say. No one asked what happened to the other 2. There were screams, yes, but not the kind that could be chased. They came muffled, from deep underground, sometimes sobs, sometimes metal against stone, always followed by silence. And then, singing. Not from the girls, from Elizabeth. A low hum, off-key, like a nursery rhyme forgotten by time. Dorcas said the humming calmed the blood. Ilona said it summoned something from the stone. Janos never spoke, but his hands shook when he poured the basins. One winter night, a girl named Kata tried to run. She made it as far as the gatehouse before the dogs were loosed, when they dragged her back. Her dress was torn, her feet bare and bleeding. Elizabeth stood waiting at the threshold, candle in hand. Kata fell to her knees. "Please," she begged. "I don't want to die." Elizabeth knelt, lifted her chin, looked into her eyes. "You misunderstand," she said. "You're not dying. You're being transformed." That night, the snow outside turned pink. And in the morning, Elizabeth wore white. Rumors crept back into the villages. Mothers began to grow suspicious. Some rode to the castle demanding word of their daughters. They were told to wait. Tea was served. Hours passed. No answers came. The lucky ones went home empty. The unlucky ones never went home at all. Elizabeth began forging letters written in shaky hands, passed along by riders with smiling faces. "Dear Mother, I am learning so much. I've never been happier. Do not worry." Each sealed in wax, each written by someone who no longer had hands. And so, the machine kept turning. The gates stayed open. The smoke kept rising, and the girls kept coming. Because hope is a door that opens wide and never warns you when it locks behind you. But the real betrayal hadn't happened yet. By winter of 1609, the blood had changed. It no longer warmed her, no longer hummed in her veins the way it used to. Elizabeth stood naked in the marble chamber, crimson streaking her arms, her chest, her thighs, and felt nothing. The mirror across the room showed her only what time refused to erase: the creases beneath her eyes, the dryness at the corners of her lips, the gray near her scalp. She wiped at her skin again, harder, but the bloom never returned. She needed something stronger, not more. Better. The girls of the countryside, dirt-fed, wind-chapped, raised on broth and superstition, they were no longer enough. Their blood lacked elegance. Their pain lacked silence. She wanted refinement. She wanted lineage. She wanted blue blood. And she believed she had earned it. She began drafting new letters, not to farmers, but to barons, viscounts, provincial nobles barely hanging onto their titles by thread and debt. Elizabeth's script was elegant, gilded in flattery. She invited their daughters for a season of cultural education, etiquette, music, Latin, French, a finishing school in the mountains. She knew exactly what words to use. Your daughter will dine at my table. She will learn beside women of power. She will return to you polished, ready for court. Most accepted. How could they not? Elizabeth Bathory was still untouchable. Cousin to princes, friend to bishops. Her husband had once trained royal guardsmen. Her family name opened doors even kings dared not shut. So they came, not by cart, but by carriage, with brocade sleeves and gloves of doeskin, with books in Latin and rosaries of ivory, with silk ribbons and eyes full of dreams. And Chactich welcomed them. The halls were scrubbed, the staff dressed finer, musicians were brought in, the stables aired, everything shimmered with performance. Elizabeth played the host beautifully. She kissed their cheeks, laughed at their jokes. She took them walking through the orchards, pointed out birds, spoke of Plato and inheritance and courtly love. And they adored her. For a time, but she couldn't wait long. The ritual resumed only this time. It was slower, quieter, more delicate. The noble girls were more fragile, their screams more refined, their blood lighter, sweeter somehow. She wrote in her journal, "There is brightness here, something close to gold." She began tracking family lines, making diagrams, comparing regions. She swore some girls bled thicker than others, depending on their ancestry. It became obsession. She bled them herself, not trusting her attendants. She marked bowls with initials, measured volume, duration, color shift over time. Janos recorded the data. Ilona disposed of the remains. Dorca started to pray before each session. "Just in case," she whispered, "in case we go too far." Elizabeth no longer listened, because something inside her had begun to believe, truly believe, that she wasn't murdering these girls. She was elevating them, transforming them, making them part of something eternal. And she didn't see the trap closing, because noble daughters had noble fathers, and noble fathers had influence. When Zuzana Salai disappeared, her family sent a letter. When the letter went unanswered, they sent another. When the second letter returned unopened, they sent a servant. He did not come back. It took only 1 week before word reached Vienna, and the court didn't laugh this time. Because rumors are tolerable when it's peasants who vanish, but noble blood, that stains too loudly. Elizabeth remained calm. She sent replies, forged letters from the missing girls, claimed illness, travel, confession, anything to buy more time. But the walls were thinning. One night, as she prepared another bath, she paused. A knock, soft but deliberate, echoed through the stone corridors. No one ever knocked here. She opened the door. A noble girl stood barefoot, bleeding from the nose, her eyes unfocused, her dress torn. She said, "I'd be beautiful," the girl murmured, "but I'm disappearing." Elizabeth pulled her inside. No one ever saw the girl again. But outside the castle, the questions multiplied. How many girls? Why no funerals? Why no marriages arranged? Why did no one come back? A noble uncle hired spies. A minor prince sent a priest. And then, finally, a report made it to Gyuri Thurzo, Palatine of Hungary, tasked with protecting the crown's honor. He knew Elizabeth personally. He had dined at her table, laughed at her wit, trusted her insight. He also knew her family could destroy reputations in a single whisper. But this wasn't whispers anymore. These were names. These were daughters. These were facts. So he waited, gathered evidence, interrogated couriers, talked to grieving mothers, bribed frightened servants. Patterns emerged, ink and blood and silence and gold. He began to believe. And Elizabeth, she kept bleeding, kept singing, kept waiting for that brightness to return to her face. But the storm had already left the mountain, and it was coming straight for her gates. The wind that night smelled of fire, not from her hearths, but from the hills. Smoke riding down from the north like a warning. Elizabeth stood at her window, fingers curled against the stone frame, eyes scanning the tree line beyond the orchards. The castle breathed beside her, as if holding its own lungs full. She knew they were coming, but she did not run. In the candlelight, she dressed slowly, layer by layer, black silk, silver laces, a collar of obsidian beads tight at her throat. Her hair was pinned with iron combs. She painted her mouth the color of clotted wine. Downstairs, the others waited. Ilona stood by the iron stove, knuckles bloodless around a basin of warm water. Dorka paced in circles, whispering to her own reflection in the glass. Janos sat motionless on the floor, staring at his hands as if they'd betrayed him. "They'll be here before morning," Elizabeth said softly. None of them answered. She didn't ask them to. Instead, she lit a candle and walked the length of the corridor. Her shadow trailed behind her like a question unanswered. She passed closed doors. She passed the chapel. She passed the room with the drains in the floor. She descended into the crypt. The cold hit her first wet. Absolute, without forgiveness. The air stung her eyes. She moved between the stone arches like she had 100 times before, each footstep memorized beneath her. Dried blood crackled like leaves. She knelt beside the table, touched the metal instruments one by one. She kissed the last one. "Thank you," she whispered. "You gave me years." Upstairs, the gates groaned. They didn't knock. They didn't need to. The iron clanged open, and armored boots filled the courtyard like thunder. Horses snorted, the fog from their breath spilling like ghosts. Georgi Thurzo rode in first. His face was pale, drawn, unreadable. Behind him, men with torches, men with swords. Elizabeth emerged from the shadows without trembling. "You're late," she said. Thurzo said nothing. He stepped aside. The soldiers spread through the castle. They didn't search. They hunted, with paper, with orders, with certainty, down corridors, into kitchens, through servants' quarters, into the cold wing, into the room with the white linens, into the darkness beneath the altar. And one by one they found them. A girl still breathing, tied at the wrists, eyes wild and unfocused. A pile of hair in the corner, a ledger soaked with ink and blood, each line a name, each name crossed. One soldier vomited. Another fell to his knees and whispered prayers he hadn't said since childhood. And Thurzo, he just stood still. The woman he had once shared wine with, once praised in letters, stood beside him now like an unholy monument, calm, straight-backed, unrepentant. "These were gifts," Elizabeth said. "They wanted to serve." "You killed them," Thurzo answered. "No," she said, and her voice never shook. "I preserved them." The trial never came. She was too noble to be dragged through the courts, too infamous to be forgiven. The crown feared what she knew, feared who might defend her, so they offered her a different ending. Stone, sealed, forgotten. They bricked her into a chamber in the coldest tower, no windows, no door, only a slit through which to pass food. The first week, she paced, the second, she sang, by the third. She spoke only to the walls. Ilona and Dorka were not so lucky. They were tied to stakes in the public square, stripped, burned. Their screams lasted longer than the fire. Janos vanished, some said prison, some said suicide, others said nothing at all. The servants scattered. The village grew quiet, and the castle. It began to close in on itself. The rooms were boarded, the stairwells rotted. Ivy cracked the stones. Birds nested where bells once rang. Time did not destroy Chocteach. It simply erased the memory of its heartbeat. And Elizabeth. She waited. Not for rescue. Not for death. But for the silence to speak back. She scratched at the walls with her nails, counted the days by the number of times they slid bread through the slit. She stopped answering, stopped eating, stopped breathing like a human being, until one day she didn't rise. No scream, no collapse, no final prayer. Only quiet. The guards opened the slit, no response. They unsealed a corner of the wall, no movement. A single candle burned low beside her bed. Her body was curled inward, hands beneath her cheek. She looked asleep, but the air was colder than it should have been. And on the wall, barely etched, almost gone, 4 words scratched in a language not spoken for centuries. I am still here. And somewhere beneath the stone, something answered. They say no one attended her burial. No priest, no family, no guards to carry the body, not even a child to weep beside the stone. The records call it August 21st, 1614, a warm morning, quiet. A servant checked the food slit and found no response. The guard cracked open the wall just wide enough to see her, curled in the corner, barefoot, eyes closed, as if waiting for something that never came. They never found a coffin. No headstone was marked. No grave blessed. The villagers say she was buried in secret under the castle floor, so that no one could dig her up again. Others whisper she was never buried at all, that her body vanished, that the walls of Choctaw swallowed her the way they swallowed so many others. But the real silence began after. The castle did not return to the earth. It did not crumble overnight. It simply slowed, like a creature put to sleep but never killed. The wind still howls through its towers. Stones still shift in the night. Travelers who pass too close say they hear footsteps above empty rooms, a voice humming low from behind bricked walls. Sometimes, when the mist is thick enough, people say they see her, standing at the upper window, hair black as pitch, eyes like a wound left open too long. Watching, waiting, and inside the tower where they sealed her, the stone is darker than the rest, damp. Breathing? A single red handprint remains just below the window slit, pressed there by something or someone who refused to leave. No one cleans it. No one dares, because every time the wind shifts just right, the walls of Choctaw whisper back. She never stopped. She only ran out of time. And the room remains sealed, but the crying, that never stopped.